Hello, Ace. It's me, Junie, behind this computer screen, even though you can't see me. And today, in case you couldn't tell, I'll be talking a little bit about the science I do in a talk entitled Too Stressed Can't Talk, exploring the effects of beep boop bop boop, a shit ton of repeatable unfortunate events on beep boop bop boop boop, horrors for stress molecules in the beep boop, cute little parakeet brain. And over here I have a cute little parakeet minus its brain. Its brain is still up here, so you can't see that. But yeah, I get to study these little guys, and they are awesome. And also my name is Junie, totally not what's blacked out under here. And this is Hey Fella Introvert, totally not Urka's 2023, for which I presented for 4 days ago. And so I'm sure you are answering yes to this question. If not, you're lying. With things like COVID-19, inflation, civil unrest, if you're a scientist like me, experiments not working, or having to live in a country with this woman, I'm sure you're feeling a little bit of stress. A lot of Americans are feeling a little bit of stress. In fact, if you look at this graphic by the American Psychological Association, it's showing you that 27% of all adults say that some days they are so stressed they can't even function. I'm not really sure what that means by they can't function, but it sounds really awful. It's especially bad for people under the ages of 45. Screw the old people. Blech, no one cares about them. But for our people like us, we're super stressed, with almost half of us saying that we're so stressed some days we can't even function. And so it's important to distinguish between two types of stressors. We have acute stress, which we call a one-time disruption to your environment. So you can think of that as something like giving a speech. I'm sure you can relate to this of you have a big speech coming up and oh my god, you're so scared and so stressed, but then it passes and it's over and it's not something you constantly have to worry about. Compare that to something like a chronic stress, which would be a repeatable, unpredictable disruption to your environment. So think of that as, for example, being homeless. You're constantly having to worry about things like where your next meal is going to be, where you're going to sleep, and even worrying about your safety. And so this stuff doesn't end, it just keeps popping up. And today I'm going to be focusing on chronic stress. And this is only one example of chronic stress. It can come in many other forms, but the general repeatable, unpredictable disruption to the environment is the stress we'll be focusing on today. And so we know that chronic stress impairs cognitive function, and that's why chronic stress is bad. For example, it can make you more likely to be addicted to certain things. It can increase your likelihood for things like depression or anxiety. It can also increase your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease, but who cares about being old? It can also make your golf game total crap. I'm sure you can relate. You're super stressed out on the course, constantly stressed about your game and doing well on the team, and then before you know it, you have a super high handicap. Total nightmare. Today, though, I'm going to be focusing on how it can impair your learning specifically, and I'm going to be looking at a type of learning. I'm going to be looking at vocal learning. How might chronic stress impact vocal learning? And that's where our friend, the budgie, comes into play. You can see two cute little fellas pictured here. And like humans, they are capable of lifelong vocal learning, which is super awesome. And so that's why they're like us humans. And they can serve as a model to understand how chronic stress, or those repeated shitty events, can alter vocal learning or language acquisition in humans. And so this is the big question that we're after. How does this happen? How does this work? And how can we maybe stop it? And over here I have a little budgie talking to his green budgie friend. How's your day going, Reginald? And Reginald is so stressed he can't even talk. Therefore, chronic stress bad. And so our big picture goal is to understand how stress impacts the budgie and how that impacts their brains and how that impacts their vocal learning. And little fun fact, this thing over here is called a spectrogram, and it's essentially just a visualization of sound. And so we're able to characterize budgie sounds or even human sounds or a different bird or animal's type of sounds using a spectrogram. It's a super handy dandy tool. But today I'm going to be focusing on the brain, specifically two receptors, the mineral corticoid receptor or MR and the glucocorticoid receptor or GR. And you're probably thinking, you lost me already. I don't understand. Well, let's make it simpler for you. So we have the mineralocorticoid receptor, and you can think of her as a liberal whore, super loosey-goose. And then we have the glucocorticoid receptor over here, who you can think of as conservative. It takes a lot of work to get her to accept Mr. Corticosterone, and she'll probably only accept him on their wedding night. So yeah, think of MR as our loosey-goosey whore, and GR as the more conservative Christian girl waiting for the right corticosterone to come by. Oh, and corticosterone is the stress hormone. So in humans, it would be cortisol, but in budgies and a lot of our other animal friends, it's corticosterone. But they're both stress hormones. And so, fun fact, stress hormones, or eggplants, are released even when you aren't stressed, or in this case, for our analogy, horny. And so let's look at what happens with the mineralocorticoid receptor, our liberal receptor, when we have a lot of when we have baseline levels of eggplants being released when we're not stressed. So here we have a brain, it's chilling, nothing crazy happening. It's still going to release a little bit of eggplant, and that eggplant is going to enter into the cell, where it will bind to any sort of available MR that we have. So our little whores, they'll bind to anything that walks on by, because MR has a high binding affinity for cort or our little eggplants. And so then once bound by the little eggplants, MR will travel into the nucleus of the cell, which, if you remember from basic biology, is where your DNA is held. And it'll be able to interact with your DNA. And from there, it'll turn some sort of genes off and others on. And so that essentially means that some genes are going to be expressed in the cell and others are not. Because if you remember, not all of the DNA in your cell is being expressed at all times. If that was the case, then you would just be one type of cell. For example, you would just be a bunch of skin cells if that was the case. But that's not the case. And so now let's look at what happens with GR, our more conservative receptor. Again, we have that happy, healthy, unbothered brain releasing some eggplants. However, GR is not really the biggest fan of cort off the bat. It has a lower binding affinity. So if there's just a couple of cort molecules floating around in the cell, they're not really likely to bind with it, because remember, our GR is pretty picky. And so because it's not bound, it's not going to be able to travel into the nucleus and interact with the cell. With the DNA. Because remember, MR and GR both need to be bound by cort, or an eggplant in this case, in order to be able to travel into the cell. So with GR, under low stress conditions, it's not going to be traveling into the nucleus of the cell, and so no genes are going to be turned on or off. Now, you may be wondering, why'd you explain what happens with stress hormones when you're not stressed? I thought we were talking about stress. Well, it's important to understand that you need the right proportion of MR and GR in order to have a happy, healthy body, even when you aren't stressed. Now, let's look at what happens with GR and MR when you are stressed. Again, starting off with our friend MR, the Lucy whore. And so we have a stressed brain. It's releasing cort, and this time it's releasing a crap ton of little eggplants. And so all of these receptors are going to travel into the nucleus, where they'll interact with the DNA, and we'll see even more genes turned on and off. Now with glucocorticoid receptor, or our little conservative bride, we have a super stressed out brain again, releasing tons of cort. And so because there's so much cort available this time, the likelihood that an eggplant is going to match with a GR increases greatly. So now these GR, very picky little conservative brides, are now matched with a GR and bound. And so now they can travel into the nucleus of the cell, where they'll interact with the DNA, and genes will be turned off and on. And we call this change in genes being turned on and off by these two receptors your stress response. And so the types of genes that they turn on and off will help you react to different stressors that come your way. And so just as a brief overview, remember we have mineralocorticoid receptor. She's our super liberal girl who will bind with anyone. Whereas glucocorticoid receptor, GR, is more conservative and it needs a lot of eggplant temptation to finally be bound by something. Now, it's critical to remember that both of these receptors play an important role in the stress response by turning certain genes on and others off. And so this allows cells to be able to respond to stressors. So it's critical that you have these receptors intact in the right proportions. However, constantly having eggplants flowing into receptors, turning genes on and off all the time can be detrimental. And we know that eggplants are released in droves when we're super stressed. So if we're constantly super stressed and constantly having eggplants binding to our receptors, that might be a disaster. And so cells might try to decrease or increase the expression of these receptors when faced with chronic stress. And so over here I have a table showing how receptor expression changes under stress conditions across different species throughout the brain. And as a reminder, our GRs are super conservative, low binding affinity for core receptor, while our MR is a little more loosey-goosey. And so you can see that oftentimes we'll see a decrease in these receptors throughout the brain in response to chronic stress. So under chronic stress, the cell is having that stress response turned on all the time. So an option might be to decrease your amount of stress hormone receptors available. However, you might notice that this table isn't totally consistent with certain changes. For example, one paper showed that GR in rats will decrease in the hippocampus under chronic stress conditions, but another paper in European starlings, which are little songbirds, found that GR didn't change in the hippocampus under chronic stress conditions. And this just goes to show how throughout the literature there's a lack of consistency with what we see and how these receptors change in response to stress. So if you're confused about what might happen to these receptors, please know that I am also confused about what might happen to these receptors. And that's called science, babe. We really oftentimes have no idea what's going on with anything. Yeah. And so, however, it's important to note that changing how many receptors you have might also be detrimental. So if you decrease, increase, that might also have bad effects. For example, too little or too much, not good. Like if you smoke too much weed, that's probably not good. Whereas if you're like Kennedy and you don't smoke any, you're boring. But you can see he improved himself here as he was high off his rocker in this photo. More seriously, Jeff Bezos, probably not a good man with all that money. However, a homeless person with nothing, also not good. You can also see that eating too much, not good. Not eating enough, also not good. A pretty basic concept. Balance is key. We need the right amount of stress hormone receptors and the right amount of stress hormone being released for our bodies to be happy and healthy. And chronic stress messes with that balance. And so my project's question has, as a reminder, I'm also interested in how chronic stress might alter vocal learning if you've forgotten that key part about vocal learning since I begun this presentation. So little reminder. Now, my project specifically is asking, how do stress hormone receptors, so GR and MR, our conservative bride and our liberal whore, change over time in response to stress in a vocal learning region of the parakeet brain? So seeing how changes in these stress hormone receptors might be correlated with altered vocal learning behaviors. And based on that table I showed you earlier, remember, with showing the decreases in a bunch of the receptors under chronic stress conditions, I predict that these receptors will decrease over time in vocal learning parts of the budgie brain. Now, you're probably saying, Kayla, the brain is huge. Where on earth do you look? Well, if I'm interested in vocal learning, I'm going to look where that happens. And one place where that happens in the budgie brain is the magnocellular nucleus of the medial striatum, which I'm sure made no sense to you, but in the lab we call it the MMST. And you can see it pictured right here, where you see the label MSTM. Yeah, doesn't match up, but I promise you they mean the same thing. So in the budgie brain, the area looks like this, and it is responsible for proper learning and mimicking of vocalizations. Now, it's important to mention that it's not the only part of the brain needed in order for the vocal learning system to be intact, but it is one region that we can look at to see if there's any changes. And so you're probably wondering, Kayla, how on earth did you do this? This sounds like a huge question to be asking. Well, we took 8 little budgies and stressed the heck out of them. And we took 8 other little budgies and they got super lucky and got to be happy. And they weren't stressed. And every single week we would take 2 brains per treatment. And so that gave us a time points component of our experiment so we could see how the expression of these receptors changed week by week under the chronic stress protocol. And then once I had all these brains, I was able to see how much GR and mRNA expression there was. Now, I'm sure you remember you have things like mRNA and then you have protein. They're not the same. mRNA codes for protein, and protein is really the thing that is doing all the things I showed you with the binding to core and going in and interacting with the DNA. However, I spent a year trying to quantify the protein expression, and I was not successful. So we had to go with the next best thing, mRNA. So here's a little graph of some results. First, we looked at how chronic stress impacts the eggplant or stress hormone production. And you can see we have these broken up in time points. So we have with week 1, week 2, week 3, and then the end of week 3. And you can see at the beginning, control and stress groups are releasing the same amount of eggplants roughly. However, by the time we get to day 22, we see a drop-off. Now, this change is not significantly different. However, I do think it is a trend showing a decrease in the production of eggplants in the stress group. So that might be a way of being like, oh my gosh, we have so much stress hormone all the time. This isn't good. And responding to that and decreasing the amount of stress hormone. Now, that might be good, but it also could have detrimental effects, like I explained earlier. And so now looking at how the levels of MR and GR changed in a vocal learning region of our control and stress birdies. Again, this is broken down by time points. For each bar, that is representing 2 individuals that we looked at. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, I'm not going to cast any judgment, but we don't see any significant differences between our control and stress birdies and the amount of MR and GR they are expressing. So control birds are not expressing more GR and MR than the stress birdies, which is contrary to what we expected. So what can we conclude from this data, if I haven't lost you already? Well, eggplants released might be changing over time in stressed birds. In fact, the amount of eggplant released might be decreasing in stressed birds. And the amount of eggplant receptors is pretty similar in the MMST in stressed and non-stressed birdies. So we're not seeing a huge impact on the amount of eggplant receptors in the MMST of either group. And so from this we can conclude that any observed changes in vocal learning might be because of one of 2 things. Or maybe we're not thinking of the answer to this question at all, and it might be something entirely different. #science. 1, a different region of the brain might be altered. Like I said, MMST is only one of the areas responsible for allowing budgies to be super awesome vocal learners. And 2, it might be the change in the amount of eggplant. So point number 1, that is screwing things up, and the receptors aren't changing at all. But of course, we would need to do further research and investigation to figure out if either of these 2 answers is correct. And again, it might be something I'm not even listing here that is causing altered vocal learning behavior in chronically stressed budgies and humans. And so I totally stole this presentation from my IRCA's presentation um, last week for my college. And so I have the acknowledgement slide from that presentation. However, everyone's face except mine, including the Birdies, is blocked out because I don't know if they'd want to be associated with the disgustingness that I brought here today. But yeah, special acknowledgments to all of these people who you can't even tell who they are. But yeah, I go to New Mexico State, in case you were wondering, and spoiler alert, the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke did sponsor this research, but what grant specifically and what lab I'm part of, you shall never know. But yeah, thank you for joining me here today. Ace, please let me know if any of this did not make sense, because if it didn't make sense, that's not your fault. That's my fault. That's her fault right here. She is the one that is guilty and responsible for that. But yeah, that is a little bit of the research I've been doing. I did take out a couple of slides from this to make it less confusing and more focused for you. And I did alter my graphics significantly. My presentation at my college did not include the whore and conservative bride distinction. But yeah, that is it. And I enjoyed your video. I loved the little reflection, and I will see you again whenever you get the chance. Toodaloo!